he is a priest at All Saints Antiochian Orthodox Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. When I was in Greensboro, some of the catechumens from Raleigh would come to visit me. One of them was Andrew Damick, Father Andrew, before he became Orthodox. It was always a lot of fun when they came over. I used to love it. I was at the Greek Orthodox Church in Greensboro, so that's my connection with Raleigh. And although I've been there once, and he is a real interest in atheism, culture, how people are thinking, the new atheism versus the old atheism. He's going to share some of his ideas with us. I think it's going to make for a very interesting discussion. You know, I was very active when we had, I call them the celebrity atheists, Christopher Hitchens, people like that. Okay, and I would listen to him, and Hitchens was very eloquent, but never really discussed things seriously. None of them did. They really didn't. They just had a massive amount of contempt, right, for it. And people were, you know, the uninitiated were kind of taken in by that contempt or intimidated by his eloquence. But there just wasn't much there. And one thing I noticed too is that a lot of the followers, so I ended up debating an atheist at the University of Delaware. And that was very interesting. And I noticed a lot of the followers actually, they were called new atheists at the time, were children of fundamentalist families. Okay. A lot of the atheists of that time were actually Christians, well, young men that were leaving their fundamentalism. Okay. This is a very interesting phenomena. And so, but now it's changed. Now it's changed, you know, culture morphs. It does. And it's a little bit different. And Father David is really keyed into that. And he's going to talk about it. So he'll talk for a little bit, and then we will open it up for questions. Father David, welcome.
Thanks, Father Hans. It's good to see the few faces in the group that I can see, but I've got 6 on the top of my screen. So anyway, hello to everybody. You know, Father Hans, you said that, you know, you mentioned the new atheists. I think, you know, the new atheists were probably at their peak. That is, you know, Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, probably right around when I was in my undergraduate or getting into my undergraduate. And it's fairly interesting. In fact, my claim to fame, okay, here it is. This is how you know that I know atheists, okay, here it is. I was actually on the ground in the famous debate between William Lane Craig and Christopher Hitchens, back at Biola University at Talbot School of Theology. I think they were paid seats in the front, but they were empty, so I just went ahead and snuck on in to hear the debate between. I mean, I didn't sneak in. That would be immoral. I paid for the ticket and then I got in there. Anyway, you know what I mean. But I was able to go in and listen to William Lane Craig debate Christopher Hitchens. They gave out a pamphlet. It wasn't a pamphlet. It was just like a one-page piece of paper. On one side, William Lane Craig offered 5 kind of syllogistic, you know, arguments for the existence of God, which was what the debate was about. And then on the other side was for Christopher Hitchens, and he left it blank. Fitting, indeed. But he said that he didn't have anything to prove, so he didn't need to add any arguments. But anyway, it was great to listen to them too. But this was kind of the heyday of the new atheism. I was able to take a class with a philosopher from USC. His name was Doug Guyvet, Professor Doug Guyvet, and he did an entire class on the new atheists. So we read, you know, Richard Dawkins and the like, and he gave us interesting assignments. One of the most interesting was go through Richard Dawkins. You know, which one was his? His wasn't the God delusion, was it? Whichever it was, and he had us try to find arguments in the text. And this is much more difficult than you might think. Just finding arguments in the text, because as Father Hans had already mentioned, there's the hallmark of the new atheist was actually their ability to speak condescendingly. theism generally, and they were very skilled at it, and Richard Dawkins was fairly skilled at this himself. But when it came to arguments, they're actually quite rare um, in his writing at least. But after I became a priest, I've started calling the new atheists, the so-called new atheists, the old atheists. These, Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens uh, are scarcely relevant today. I think even among the incoming atheists. Um, and this was always the case for me. I never once considered myself an atheist. Never even thought of it. Uh, but uh, but I was at least interested in the new atheists. But today it would be difficult for me even to be interested. And I find this similarly the case among the incoming atheist class, so to speak. I think there's actually some very interesting and worthwhile differences between like the Gen Z or the young millennial atheists that I think are fairly common between them. You guys know atheists yourself, so take what I say. I'm no expert. It's either it's true or it's not, and you guys will know as well as I do. But there seems to be some notable differences between the so-called new atheists and the newer atheists that I think are worth noticing. When that young man came to my church, the atheist, his name's Jared, and he made that video. Father Hans, had you mentioned this already? Everybody knows that that young atheist man who made that video was at my church. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, well, so now you know. He's an interesting fella. And but I find many similarities between him and others. One of the things that everybody says about this young man after they see this video is they are rather skeptical that he's an atheist at all. And I was able to speak to him about this, and he says, "Yeah, no one really believes that I'm an atheist." And I offered to him a suggestion as to why. I think we're a little bit used to the new atheists, that is the so-called new atheists, Dawkins and Hitchens and the like. And when we think of atheists, we think of like, early Gen X boomers who are kind of making assertions about complicated things as if they're not complicated at all. Even, and as I said to Father Hans when I saw him last week, I was like, once somebody gets into a conversation about existence, you're in pretty deep waters. Once you get into a conversation about God, you're in very deep waters. If you start a conversation about God and his existence, you're in more deeply than you realize, almost certainly. And it seems to me that the newer atheists um, are aware of this, at least intuitively. They're aware that they're not speaking about anything simple when it comes to meaning or God or existence. Nonetheless, they still identify as atheists and they propose that God doesn't exist, but they're different about it. They will, for instance, this young atheist who comes to my church. If you watch his video, what's really clear is that he's unashamedly he'll unashamedly confess that he perceives meaning in things, right? That are nearly spiritual, at least, or basically spiritual in nature. And this I think is different than Dawkins. If Dawkins was able to find meaning in anything, he would immediately try to weaponize it, right? I remember him telling a story about a nun that taught him in his childhood years, where the nun had said something about how kind God must be because he made the earth green, and green soothes us when we see it, and things like this. And Dawkins, remembering this as a crusty atheist in his later years, weaponized it, saying, that this isn't evidence for God any more than I can't even say the kinds of things he says, but But he weaponized even this woman's desire to see kindness in creation through the greening of of nature. I don't think that the newer atheists are actually all that inclined to do such a thing. I think that they perceive actually some very good quality in. If I were to say, "Oh, isn't it nice that the world is green?" They wouldn't go about trying to deny it. They would go about it entirely differently. Um, and so I find this to be true among many of the newer atheists, not least of those the young atheists that came to my church rather recently. Um, if I was to try to put my finger on this difference, it would have something to do with the allowance of the perception of meaning among the younger atheists, such that we can have meaningful conversations about the spiritual value of things, etc. By the way, I see a question here, Gary, in the comments. Should I take these?
Sure,
Should I
sure,
engage? What are you thinking?
sure. That's fine.
All right, let me see. I saw. Oh, how would the new atheist go about it? Well, yeah, you know, here's when you say new atheists, I'm gonna assume you mean the newer atheists. But for instance, I was talking to this young man. I've had, I think, probably like 5 conversations with people who say they're atheists within the last week. Probably has something to do with this video. But they're all of a similar age. They're all young. They're either in their early 30s or even some of them in their early 20s. And and when I was talking to them, one of the things I talked to them about is what I call the problem of meaning. I might have mentioned this to Father Hans earlier this week too. So forgive me if I repeat myself, Father. But the old lines of the of the atheists was like, obviously atheism somehow boils down to something like nihilism, and everybody knows it. So part of the conversation is always just kind of pointing out, it's like, things don't mean what you think they mean. It's kind of like an illusion. Um, but the new atheists, this isn't the case. Uh, and I think they're just perfectly happy to see that meaning is built into our experience and it's impossible to escape. As I pointed out to the atheists I was speaking to, I think it was Sunday. I told him it's like, it's so built in that here we are talking and you're looking at my face as we speak. I mean, you already know where the meaning lies and you're deeply engaged in interpreting it, even in these kind of basic experiences that we're having now. The, you know, the difference, I think, the fundamental difference between atheists and Christians isn't so much a recognition of meaning. It's really just kind of where we identify the key, so to speak. Where's the basic hermeneutic? Um, Whereas for Christians, I assert what I believe Jesus asserts himself, that he's the hermeneutic for reality. He's the key to interpreting everything. And sometimes people are surprised when I say this. The atheists have no idea what I'm talking about when I say this, but so it's always good conversation. But as I point out to them, it's Jesus himself who teaches us that he is the hermeneutic through which we see the meaning of things, the true meaning of things. If you remember, Jesus, he says, if anyone wishes to come after me, let him pick up his cross daily and follow me. Daily is the word that's used in the Gospel of Luke. And this is, I think, very important because, if Jesus weren't speaking symbolically here, it would be a very confusing thing to say, because how many times can one pick up a literal cross in the way that Jesus is inviting them to? Precisely one time, because at the end of it, you're dead. Uh, but but Jesus is offering us something else. He's offering us a particular hermeneutic, which is him. a way by which we come to know the meaning of things insofar as we perceive him in them. In this instance, it's the cross. I think if I were to try to say Jesus' words in another way, it'd be like, insofar as we perceive Christ's cross in things, particularly in our sufferings, then if we wish to be his disciple, we would pick it up. And if we've done this, then we would have perceived things correctly. This isn't even the only time that Jesus does this. If you remember, Jesus similarly in the judgment gospel, he says, "Whatever you do to the least of these, my brothers, you do to me." Which, of course, we could just simply brush off as like a literary mechanism. But Jesus says, if you do whatever you do to the least of these brothers, you've done to me, seemingly suggesting that insofar as we perceive him, the Logos, who indwells all things, in the least of these, then we've perceived it correctly, and that will be judged accordingly. Jesus does this. I have like a list of ways in which Jesus does this, so perhaps another time. But it seems to me that fundamental to Jesus' teaching is that he's the hermeneutic to reality, the way by which we come to know the meaning of things, because he's in all things. And so anyway, atheists. So for me as a Christian, I'm on this trajectory. I'd like to, insofar as I exist between, the poles of belief and disbelief, I would prefer to have my soul and body move more and more towards belief. I think insofar as one confesses that they're an atheist, they're simply on another trajectory. They still perceive the meaning of things, but by their very confession, I think that they're actually on a trajectory towards the other pole, at least want to be. That is towards disbelief. The title of this evening's talk is what is it?
Are atheists really atheists?
Yeah, are atheists really atheists? Now, this young man who came to my church, everybody doubts whether or not he's an atheist, but I think really what all they're perceiving is that he is stuck between the poles of belief and disbelief in a way that strikes us as incoherent. But though it may be incoherent, given that if he were a real atheist, we might say if he was genuinely, truly, really committed to be an atheist, we'd say perhaps he would be a true nihilist. He would genuinely act towards some other human being the same way he'd act towards a rat or dust, because these things are meaningless. At least the meaning of them doesn't transcend anything. But the truth of the matter is, I think that Christians are actually stuck between the same poles. Consider what it would be for a Christian to believe truly and fully that Christ is Lord and that he is risen from the dead, and that you've come to know him through revelation in his church, which he established. Imagine believing such a thing. Yeah, well, what would it mean if we are no longer stuck between these poles of belief and disbelief, but we believe this truly in our heart and that we encountered Christ truly in the church and in the sacraments and in our hearts and in prayer? I would think that we'd be somewhere very close to sinless, in the very least. And who can even speak of the other things that we might be if we weren't stuck between these poles of belief and disbelief? And so I think that when people see the new atheist, they actually just perceive that they're similarly stuck between these poles. They're incoherent. They don't believe truly and fully what it is that what they say they believe. But they have a confession of their own. And their confession is that God is not. And yeah. And so if they were rational, they believe, at least in the very least, that they would act this way. I think that what's really interesting is when you find someone who's kind of aware that they are stuck between these poles of belief and disbelief. And and are up for a good conversation. The atheist who made that video, I asked him why he calls himself an atheist. Um, and he said, he could be wrong about anything, and he knows this very much. He knows this very well. He could be wrong about anything, but he said he feels like if he said to people that he was like an agnostic or something, that they would perceive it as like a window of hope, like maybe they'd be able to grasp his soul and yank it towards Jesus or something like this. And he said that's probably not true. He said, at least in his case. Um, so instead, he calls himself an atheist because he thinks that God is not. He doesn't believe that God exists, and that humans have more in common with dirt than they do the divine. So anyway, and the funny thing is, I said I believe the same. He wasn't as he has a MDiv too, but it's like yeah we were made from dust, you know. So anyway, forgive my my aimless ponderings here.
Men are in crisis. And men are in crisis because they don't know who they are or what they were created for. It affects their lives in big ways. You were not meant to struggle alone. Step out of the chaos. Discover the man that God created you to be. We challenge you. Join us. You will discover a life worth living. Join the Brotherhood.